Here we go. So today we're talking about systems and types of governments. These are not just our system; it's systems throughout the kind of the world, but just general variations. And we're going to be kind of brief about it. We're not going to get into too much depth on worldwide systems. We're going to focus on ours, but we'll go over it here. So there are two basic so-called systems. One is called the unitary system. Unitary system is all the key powers that a government has is held by the national government, by the central government. And so the central government really kind of tells any kind of local governments, regional governments within that overall country, the what to do. They've got a lot of power. Okay, so England, France. England isn't even really a country. This is Great Britain is the country. United Kingdom. England's confusing because England is part of Great Britain, the United Kingdom, and that includes Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, and so it's a little confusing. But at the end of the day, it is controlled by, like England in this case, by the Parliament, by the national government, and those other systems have less authority. Okay. The one I really want you to know, though, is the federal system, or federalism. We call it federalism, where powers are divided between the national government and state and local governments. So in this case, the national government has certain things it does, and then the state and local governments have other powers that are beyond the control of the national government. So this is our system. It's called federalism. It's actually, as what it does is it gives state and local governments some autonomy, some authority over things, and it's both good and bad. It's actually been a little bit problematic in the past year, so with the pandemic. So one of the reasons for the kind of disjointed rollout of how we handle COVID is we got a federal system. So there was not a lot necessarily that the national government could do with state governments. I mean, Governor Newsom had a lot more power, for better or for worse. The Governor DeSantis in Florida has a lot more power. The governors and the states have a lot more authority over, is that state being locked down? Can schools reopen? Can they not reopen? This is not a national government thing. There is no national school system. Every state and then districts within the state have control over, say, education. And so, if like President Biden went on yesterday and said, hey, we want schools to open, in the first 100 days, we want as many schools as possible to be open as long as possible. Well, that's great, but there's just not a lot that the president can do. Ask Mr. Trump. President Trump was constantly saying, hey, open the schools, open them up, and they should all be open. But that's just him saying it because there's no national way to force that. And think about the election, right? We had this whole, insurrection, riot, problems with the election. Well, that's because every state runs their own election. There's no national election. When you elect a president, it's based on the results of each state and each kind of county and city within the state. So there's no national system. The national federal government does not run the elections. Maybe we should. You might make the argument that after the fiasco and the doubt of this, maybe unreasonable doubt, but the doubt about the election results, maybe there should just be a federal system, and it shouldn't be so disjointed. Different states do different things and have different deadlines, and who can vote, and when will they accept absentee ballots and things like that. But that's all the result of this federal system, or the notion of federalism. So we have always kind of valued, kind of as much as possible, the independence of states. There are certain things that states can and cannot do based on federal, national, constitutional rules, but there's a lot of things the states can do separately, individually, as they want, as they see fit. A lot of local autonomy and local control. Whether it's, for instance, at one point, same-sex marriage was allowed in certain states, but not allowed in others. Well, that's a federal system. Some states thought it was okay, some states didn't. And then what changed that? Well, what changed it was the Supreme Court had a ruling. And the Supreme Court said, oh, you're violating rights. You're violating their constitutional rights of equal protection clause called the 14th Amendment. And so no state can have a law that doesn't allow same-sex marriage. And so ever so often, the national government intervenes and says, usually it's when rights and constitutional issues come into play. Um, or if a national law is supposed to supersede state law. So, marijuana was legalized a couple years ago in California, as well as a lot of other states, but it's still a federal crime. So technically, the feds can come in and lock you up for growing it or having it or whatever, even though states have said it's okay. So when there's a clash, the federal government law is supposed to rule. They're talking about raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. It's one of the proposals. Well, if they do that, currently the federal minimum wage I think is I just look it up. I think it's like $8.25 an hour. And so certain states don't have their own minimum wage. So they just use the federal minimum wage, the national minimum wage. California has its own, but currently the California wage is less than 15. So if they were to all of a sudden go, bam, minimum wage $15 an hour, then our wage, which I think is 14 right now, I think it just went to 14, then you would all get raises because the federal law would supersede the state law. You would have to, so business would have to follow the federal law. So that's part of our federal system, this division of power between national governments and state and local governments. Okay. There's also what's called a confederation. Confederation is it's not necessarily a full-blown government. It's an alliance, really, of maybe independent states. So, like for instance, we will learn about the Articles of Confederation. That was our very first government. So we had the Declaration of Independence. We fought the British coming, fought them, won, right? We won victory. Hey, victory. George Washington led the troops in Valley Forge and crossing the Delaware and all that, right? All this stuff. And then we'd say, well, now what do we do, right? Now we got to create this government. The last notes I talked about states, right? We had the Declaration of Independence of these United States, lowercase u. Well, we needed some kind of an alliance, like each state, New York and Virginia and little Rhode Island, and these states weren't going to be able to protect themselves against, say the British come back again, which, by the way, they do in the War of 1812. So they do come like 20, 30 years later. Well, so what they formed was, but they wanted their independence. So they wanted to be a state. They wanted their own money system. They wanted to rule themselves, but they realized they need some kind of an alliance to be able to work together. So they created the Articles of Confederation right there. That was our very first constitution. So if you ever have a test question, what's our first government? The answer is the Articles of Confederation. So this was a very, very loose, they had a legislature branch, but it was like all 13 states had one representative, and you needed like 9 of the 13 to pass. There was no president. They didn't have a military. Every state had their own money system, all kinds of issues with the Articles of Confederation. And at the end of the day, they realized it was just too loose. It was too weak. But that's what a confederation is, an alliance kind of. It was almost more of a military alliance, even though they didn't have a military, but they knew, hey, we're going to work together. We're going to let the British know that we're still a unit and you can't come back and pick on us. And so that was Articles of Confederation. And it kind of fell apart with something called the Shays Rebellion and some other issues, financial issues. And they had a Constitutional Convention and created the Constitution as we know it. Okay. There's something called the European Union. That's also kind of a confederation. So whereas Germany and France and Great Britain's kind of on the outs with Brexit, Spain and Italy and European countries, they have a union. They actually have a headquarters. There's like a president or a prime minister or president. I forget which one. They've got like a parliament kind of deal. They've got a representative body. They create some rules. They create some laws. And yet each country is still independent of this. But they've got their euro, right? Their dollar. They got a money system that is good wherever. If you're a citizen of Germany, you can travel. Open borders, any country you want in Europe. And so that's once again a confederation. Confederation. All right. What do we got? Okay, next topic here. A constitution. The term the Constitution gets thrown out a lot. What the heck is the Constitution? That's unconstitutional. That violates my rights. Okay. So what is it? It's really just a plan. It's a rule. It's how a government is going to be constructed. That's really what the Constitution is. It's actually a relatively short document, but it lays out how the Senate is created, how many members, and how the president is elected, and what the powers of the president are, and what the powers of Congress are. It lays out really, really briefly what the judicial branch is, and so it's just rules, basic rules. They're not laws per se; they're rules of government. Okay, so it serves three purposes, or these major purposes. I think they're saying. It sets out our ideals. So last time I showed you that video of "We the People," well, that's the values, like the preamble for the Constitution, sets up what the Constitution is supposed to provide, what it's supposed to bring about. So we will look over that line some point. As I said before, it sets out the basic structure of government and defines powers. And then it is the supreme law of the land. So the Constitution is supposed to be it. It's the supreme law. No other law can conflict with the Constitution. So when you hear the phrase, that's unconstitutional, well, that's the idea. It's supreme law. So the Supreme Court, when they make their judgments, they are going to look to the Constitution. They are going to make sure that the Constitution is being followed and adhered to. Okay. There's the Constitution right there. We the people of the United States, to ensure the domestic tranquility and the common defense, right, for ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution. I'm kind of reading it barely up there. Okay. Constitution can be written or unwritten. Ours, of course, is written. Right? Ours is written. There we go. Unwritten is the British. They don't have one document. They just have multiple documents. They've got, Magna Cartas and multiple documents that have been written. They've got tradition of the courts. So theirs is a little more maybe almost flexible or loosey-goosey or subject to change because it is not written down. It is multiple documents over the course of literally 1,000+ years. And agreements that are made between the king and parliament, and the king and the people, and so that it becomes they do have a English civil rights. They've got documents that are similar to ours. That was the Parliament building. I'm not. Well, let me see. I might be able to play this for a second. Check this out. This is the British Parliament. A lot different than ours.
Order, I say to the children's minister, try to calm down and behave like an adult, and if you can't, if it's beyond you, leave the chamber, get out, we'll manage without you. Mr. David Ward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Speaker, what came for the... This is intolerable behaviour as far as the public... No, it's not funny. Only in your mind, Mr. Norton, is it funny. It's not funny at all. It's disgraceful. Mr. David Ward. Order! 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 The honourable member must sit down if I rise my feet. Order! He will not continue the debate from a sedentary position, otherwise he will get into real trouble. What we need to do, both in Britain and Europe, is to combine...
That's the Prime Minister.
...reduction, which has given us the low interest rates, with an active monetary policy, with structural reforms to make us competitive, and with innovative ways of using our hard-won credibility, which we wouldn't have if we listened to the muttering idiot sitting opposite me.
It's so funny, the British. So the British were That's their parliament. They're allowed to yell. They're allowed to laugh. They're allowed to like. They're so much different than our system. Even as you watch the impeachment and electoral college proceedings, I mean, ours is just so much more muted and toned down. You just don't see it. So this is a really brief. You see how boring ours sounds. All right, I'm gonna skip. It's not that important, but whoop. So let me seem frozen here. Okay. Anyway, that was that. What kind of a constitutional? Here's the deal: a constitutional government is a limited government. It limits the powers of those who govern, right? And it is supposed to have a rule of law as one of our fundamental belief systems, fundamental part of the Constitution, where no one is above the law. This, has been a little bit challenged the past year or two. There's questions. Were there violation of law? Has the president had? I mean, there are questions before. Did Hillary Clinton, with her emails, what are we? How do we hold public officials accountable? And everyone's supposed to be able to follow the law, and the law is supposed to apply to everybody, and that is one of our fundamental beliefs. And it's how the Constitution is set up. So, rule of law, know that. Okay. This is kind of a repeat. I am not. Well, what makes it a limited government? Okay, so if we're a constitutional government, what makes it limited? Why are we limited? There are limits on the powers. I got to tell you, because once again, when President Trump was in office, he wanted things to happen, and he ran into this the limits. He ran into the idea that he couldn't just build the wall. He couldn't just lower taxes. He couldn't just open up pipelines or whatever he wanted to do. There were limits. He couldn't just take all the troops home from Afghanistan. There were limits. There were rules. There were things that got in the way. Congress got in the way. The Supreme Court got in the way. The Bill of Rights got in the way. So there were limits on what a government can do. So the Bill of Rights, Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, so freedom of speech, freedom of press, right to bear arms. Those are all limits on what the government can do to us. Those protect our rights to do things, which means if you protect our rights, it limits the government's power. So there are limitations. It is not an all-powerful government. Okay, I am going to actually wrap this up. So that is it for systems of government. The next video I'll have will be on types of governments, including democracy. And so that'll be next. So I'm going to end this. If you have any questions, send me an email. Talk to me in class.